Super Mario Bros. Was released in 1993 and was directed by Rocky Morton and Annabel Jankel, and stars Bob Hoskins, John Leguizamo, and Dennis Hopper, and is based on Nintendo's Super Mario video game franchise, and follows two Brooklyn plumbers, Mario and Luigi, who must travel to another dimension to rescue a princess from the evil dictator King Koopa and stop him from taking over the world. Super Mario Bros. Is one of those infamous movies that you hear about. It's been memed on, hated on, and is held up there as not only one of the worst video game movies ever made, but one of the worst movies ever made, period. Which I find to be a tad harsh. And I'm here to tell you that, in the end, I really don't think this movie is that bad, and we'll be diving in heavy into the things I think this movie does well in a bit, because I feel like this film is always talked about with negativity because of the changes it makes to the source material, and it's become part of the collective unconscious now that this movie is just bad with little redeeming about it, and all I have to say is that this is just not the case. I watched this film for the first time just a few months ago when several of my friends got together around the holiday season to watch some movies together like we try to do every year. And this is one of the films we decided on watching, and for a few of us, we had a total blast. The film might not be the Super Mario Bros. Movie the fans or even the world wanted, but I still think we ended up with a fairly creative film that's worth talking about and not just for its negative aspects. But before we get into that, let's do what we always do here and go behind the scenes to see just how this film was made. The story of this particular Super Mario Bros. Movie starts with Roland Joffe and his production company Leitmotiv, who had an interest in making a film adaptation of the famous video game series. So Joffe eventually met with Nintendo of America, where he presented an initial draft of the script. This pitch meeting went very well, and Joffe ended up leaving the meeting with a $2 million contract, giving him temporary control over the Mario character. When asked why Nintendo should sell the rights to Leitmotiv over a major company, Joffe assured them that Nintendo would have more control over the film. However, Nintendo had no interest in creative control and believed the Mario brand was strong enough to allow an experiment with an outside industry. The first screenplay was written by Oscar-winning screenwriter Barry Morrow. His story followed brothers Mario and Luigi on an existential road trip so similar to Morrow's prior film Rain Man that production titled the script Drain Man. Morrow described his screenplay as a study in contrast, like Laurel and Hardy or Abbott and Costello, that would have an odyssey and a quest like the video game itself. Co-producer Fred Persaro later said that Morrow's story was more of a serious drama piece as opposed to a fun comedy. Screenwriters Jim Genuine and Tom S. Parker were brought on to write a more traditional adaptation. His and Parker's take on the story was to subvert fairy tale cliches and satirize them, as well as focus on the relationship between Mario and Luigi. Greg Beeman of License to Drive was attached to direct, and development had already moved into pre-production, but the failure of Beeman's recent Mom and Dad Save the World led to his dismissal by nervous producers. Joffe then offered Harold Ramis the directing position, but though he was a fan of the video game, Ramis declined the opportunity, which he would later reflect being glad about it, and stating that it was the smartest career decision that he had ever made. When it came to adapting the story, they believed that the story should take the darker approach that similar adaptations had already experimented with, such as Batman 89 and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And the film would serve as a prequel of sorts to the game, telling the true story of the game before the events of the series. A lot of the inspiration for some of the film's crazier ideas would come from the most recent game in the series, Super Mario World, such as the parallel universe where dinosaurs live, being inspired by Dinosaur Land in the video game. and screenwriters Parker Bennett and Terry Runt were tasked with balancing comedy with a darker tone, but were dropped because their work was seen as too comedic for what they were going for. However, as the film entered into pre-production fully, producers Jaffe and Eberts feared the project had both skewed too far from the intended young adult family audiences and had become too effects-heavy to film within the budget. So without informing directors Morton and Jankel or the signed cast, they hired screenwriters Ed Solomon and Ryan Rowe to provide a more family-friendly script with more restrained effects requirements. This became a whole fiasco as the script the actors originally signed on for was completely changed into the film we have now. Principal photography of the film began on May 6th of 1992 and wrapped on July 27th of that year. Contrary to many reports, directors Morton and Jankel did complete the contracted shooting of the film, though director of photography Dean Semler and several second unit directors provided additional reshoots. Production designer David Snyder approached turning the Mushroom Kingdom into the live-action setting of Dino Hatton by taking all the elements that are in the video game and turning them into a metaphor and combining them with 3D and real characters. Lead creatures designer and supervisor Patrick Tatopoulos was aware of the concurrent Jurassic Park production, so he consciously designed the dinosaurs for Super Mario Bros. To be more cute and cartoon-like with inspiration from Beetlejuice. He described Yoshi as an abstract fantasy T-Rex and designed the baby dinosaur with large eyes to evoke a softer and less menacing quality. Lead special effects sculptor Mark Mater compared Yoshi to a cross between a Tyrannosaurus Rex and an iguana. 4 versions of the Yoshi puppet were built: a stand-in, a wireless model, a half puppet for the tongue, and a fully functional model. The fully functional puppet utilized 70 cables and 9 operators, costing $500,000. The film would go on to be a financial bomb despite the popularity of the video game series behind it, only grossing nearly $39 million on a $48 million budget. And upon its release, it was bombarded with terrible reviews, and since its release has been considered one of the worst video game movies and worst movies ever made. This is a very interesting film with apparently a VHS quality extended cut that I haven't seen yet, but would like to eventually see. Clearly, a lot of work ended up going into this movie, although a lot of that has become overshadowed by the film's reputation, and as we speak, we're just a few days away from a new adaptation of Mario, which looks to be giving fans and audiences exactly what they want. But with all that out of the way, let's go into my actual thoughts on this very interesting film. Now, let's get into this strange and bizarre little film. First off, if you thought I was going to be overly negative about this film, like the majority of critics, fans, and pretty much everyone across the internet, you might be a little disappointed because at the end of the day, I really don't think this film is that bad. And that's not me saying it's so bad it's good. I think it's a film with a lot of interesting ideas, solid performances, and a great production design. But it just doesn't add up to a very good movie. But a fun and very interesting film to watch nonetheless. Also, I know it's very easy to say the film isn't like the video games that were coming out at the time as well, but for me, this has never been a criticism I've found very valid with any kind of adaptation, whether it's based on a video game, book, comic, or so on. What ultimately matters is if the film is good and if it can set itself apart from its source material. So you won't be hearing me say, this isn't anything like Super Mario Bros. That's just not what this review is about, but I will bring up some of the things they did keep from the game and twist into their own counterparts. So with all that said, let's talk about this thing. So right off the bat, there are several things I have to praise in this film, and those are the performances, particularly Bob Hoskins and John Leguizamo, who play the title roles, the special effects, and the set design. Let's start off with talking about those performances. Honestly, this was perfect casting right from the start. Bob Hoskins is the perfect person to play a live-action Mario, and he brings with him an energy that lasts throughout the whole film. He's also just a natural when it comes to comedic moments, which are prevalent throughout the film, and there's never a time while I was watching that I felt like he was phoning in his performance. And his camaraderie with his co-star John Leguizamo is truly perfection. These two work well off of each other and provide us with that brotherly, almost fatherly dynamic I think this film needed, and it ends up giving the movie some much needed heart. As for John Leguizamo, it's true they change his character a little bit for this particular story, but the changes they make I think serve this character well and make him equally entertaining. They even make the interesting choice of giving him a love interest through the character of Daisy, who was the lesser known of the two princesses introduced in the Game Boy game Super Mario Land. These two are actually really good together, and for what it is, John Leguizamo and Samantha Mathis do a solid enough job of helping us buy this romance. There's other small roles I could mention, such as Mojo Nixon as Toad, who is completely unrecognizable from his video game counterpart, but for the time he's in there, he's actually pretty funny. But my favorite side character has to be Francesca P. Roberts, who plays Big Bertha, who was supposed to be a big fish in the original game, but has now been turned into a big black lady, and ends up dancing with Mario in an honestly pretty funny scene. Lastly, there's of course Dennis Hopper, who plays King Koopa in this film, and when people talk about this movie, they usually talk about nothing but Dennis Hopper and his memorable dialogue, and although I agree that this performance is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, it's also just memorably bad. Dennis Hopper is the only one I feel like that doesn't try to gel with the material. He's incredibly hammy, and you can tell he just doesn't care, and his line delivery just feels so wrong. It's funny because looking back, everyone really does seem to be giving it their all. Next, though, we have to talk about those visual effects. This film is an effects extravaganza, and I truly was not expecting that when I watched this film. We have Mario and Luigi being sucked into a pipe into an alternate world. We have the Koopas running around with their big bodies and tiny little heads that makes them cute rather than intimidating. We have ray beams like this film took scenes from Ghostbusters, and all things considered, it's actually kind of impressive that a good chunk of it looks pretty cool. And when it doesn't, it's still just so creative. You can't help but have fun looking at it and admiring some of the work. We also have to bring up Yoshi, who is in this film, and yeah, he's not the cute little dinosaur from Super Mario World, but he is a cute little weirdly realistic dinosaur. It's off-putting, which makes it all the more funny when Yoshi eventually gets stabbed in the film in one of the film's more violent scenes. In fact, let's move on to talking about that. This film's tone is very weird and not at all how I would picture a Mario film. But if you listened at all to my behind-the-scenes section, you'll know that they were influenced by things like Batman '89 to make a darker kind of film, and for what they were going for, I think it mostly ends up working alright. And that leads me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is the set design. Dino Hatton truly is a sight to behold. In terms of set designs, this is masterful work. There's so much character in the environment, from the fungus being spread everywhere throughout, to the dark, steamy alleyways and factory settings. It truly feels like you've been transported to another world, and they truly didn't have to go this hard on this movie, but they did. In fact, I would say this film put way more effort into its production than most other video game adaptations that came out around the time, and it shows. And even though the film doesn't really have too much to do with the game, it strangely ends up having a lot of references that honestly you probably wouldn't realize are references. You'd be surprised though that they did incorporate such things as King Koopa / Bowser, Iggy and Spike, Princess Daisy, Bob-ombs, traveling through a pipe, and even the characters getting their classic costumes at the end, which are really cool to see in live action, honestly. However, with all this fun stuff and changes, does this still make the film a good movie? Well, almost. I don't want to go too much into it because there's already a number of videos that have pointed out the film's problems, but some of those I feel like are a little unwarranted complaints, such as the scene where we learn Mario and Luigi's last name. I find that stuff pretty funny, honestly. But yeah, not everything works in this film. As creative as the film is, it can't help that the film is pretty uninspiring, sometimes a little dull. Moments did go by where I just lost interest in the film, and honestly, as crazy as Dennis Hopper is in the film, and it seems to be the one everyone talks about when talking about this film, I find him dull and boring. It's one of those films that just doesn't quite cross the threshold into being a good movie at the end of the day. It's still not very good, but it has some many creative ideas, a bonkers story, great casting, and mostly solid performances, and I think it should be remembered for more than just being a bad movie or one of the worst video game adaptations. It's a pretty harmless film that has some fun, but can grow a bit tiring. If you looked at the film from that perspective, I think you might come away with a whole new perspective on the film. So, with all that said, I'm gonna give Super Mario Bros. A 5 out of 10. I was very close to giving this film a 6 out of 10, but I just don't see myself returning to this film much. Maybe to eventually watch the extended cut of the film, but other than that, I'll pass. But I will say it's been a few months since I've seen this film, and there are still parts that I do think about. So, who knows? Maybe I'll rewatch it in time and think differently, but this is how I feel. It's pretty okay, but not really that good either, and that's better than what most people would say about it. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you. I cannot wait for this new Mario movie to come out. It looks really good, and I hope that maybe somewhere the film might have some weird reference to this movie, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. But as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.